Ciora had a system. She had built it carefully, over the 3 years since the end of the relationship that had taught her, in the most expensive way possible, exactly how much of herself she was capable of losing. The system was not complicated. She kept her apartment clean and her schedule full. She was kind to people in the measured, appropriate way that does not invite reciprocity. She did not stay in conversations longer than the situation required. She had friends, good ones, real ones, but she managed the depth of even those with the specific precision of someone who has learned that depth is not the same thing as safety, and that the two are very easy to confuse when you want something badly enough. The system worked. She was fine. She had been fine for 3 years, and fine was not everything, but it was solid, and solid was something she trusted now in a way she had never trusted anything that sparkled. She met Dowen on a Tuesday in the kind of rain that commits. Not a special Tuesday. That is always how it happens. He was standing outside the same convenience store she always went to after late nights at the design firm where she worked, standing under the narrow awning, jacket already dark with water from the walk he had clearly just come in from, holding a cup of instant ramen he hadn't opened yet. She came out with her bottle of barley tea and her earphones in, and he said, not to her, to no one in particular, the way people say things they didn't mean to say out loud, that he had forgotten how much he hated rainy Tuesdays. She took one earphone out. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, sorry. She said, no, I agree with you. And walked to the bus stop. He watched her go with the particular expression of a man who has just seen something he wasn't expecting. She did not think about him on the bus. That was what she told herself. She did not think about the specific quality of his voice when he said sorry, the way it was genuine, no performance, no social reflex, just a man who actually meant it. She did not think about his hands around the ramen cup. She had a system and it was working perfectly, and she did not think about him at all. Dowen had his own version of the system. He called it something else, called it clarity, called it knowing what he wanted, called it being realistic, but it was the same structure underneath: keep enough distance that the things that matter to you can't be used as leverage. He was 33 and he had learned, through the kind of specific experience that does not require repetition, that he was capable of loving someone in a way that consumed him entirely. That this capacity was not a gift. That it had the potential to be the most dangerous thing about him. He had decided, with the full force of his considerable intelligence, to never again do anything at full capacity when it came to love. He had kept this decision for 2 years. He had been very disciplined about it. He was a structural engineer who spent his days calculating the exact load a thing could carry before it failed. He understood, on a bone-deep technical level, that every structure had a threshold. That exceeding it did not weaken the structure gradually, it collapsed it. He had applied this understanding to himself with what he believed was wisdom. He had not been unhappy, exactly. He had been functional. He had been the version of himself that did not exceed his own threshold. When he saw her again, 3 days after the rainy Tuesday, at the same convenience store, because she always came on late work nights and he had come back not because he was thinking about her, he told himself, but because he needed ramen, he knew, with the same precision he applied to load-bearing calculations, that he was in trouble. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Because when she saw him she said, "You came back." Not as a question. As a statement. As if she had noticed, which meant she had been paying attention, which meant he was not the only one, that he was the only person in the world who understood exactly how structurally unsound it was to be glad about that. And he was glad. They ended up eating the ramen at the small plastic table inside the convenience store because the rain had not stopped and neither of them wanted to name a reason to leave. This was how it started, not with a plan, not with intention, but with two people who both had very good reasons to be careful and were, for 20 minutes at a small plastic table, choosing not to be. She told him she was a graphic designer. He said, "What kind?" She said, "The kind that has opinions about fonts that nobody asked for." He said, "What's your opinion on serif fonts?" She said, "That they're for people who want to look like they're saying something important whether they are or not." He said, "I work in structural engineering." She said, so you spend your days deciding what things can hold. He said, yes. She said, and what happens when they can't? He said, they tell you first, if you know how to listen. Everything under stress makes a sound before it breaks. She looked at him. He looked at her. They were not talking about buildings. She asked, at some point, why he came back to the same store. He said, the ramen here is better than anywhere near my apartment. She said, that's not true, I've had it. He said, I know. A pause. Neither of them moved. She said, okay. He said, okay. Outside the rain had thinned to something navigable. Neither of them reached for their jackets. They ordered 2 more cups of ramen from the exhausted and entirely unbothered convenience store worker who had seen everything this city had to offer at midnight and was not interested in adding to the count. The second cup tasted like the beginning of something that neither of them was ready to name. They walked to the bus stop when the rain stopped, and the city at midnight was doing what Seoul always does at midnight, ignoring the people inside it with the complete indifference of something enormous and indifferent and beautiful. At the stop she said her bus was the 472. He said his was the 370. These buses stopped at the same corner. Neither of them mentioned this was a fact they had both clearly already known. Waiting, he said, I should tell you something. She looked at him. He said, I don't do this. This. Whatever this is. I haven't done this in a long time and I'm not sure I'm good at it anymore. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have a system. He said, what kind? She said, the kind that means I don't end up at convenience store tables at midnight with structural engineers talking about what buildings sound like before they break. He said, and? She said, and the system has been working perfectly and I am standing at this bus stop anyway. His bus came first. He got on. Through the window she watched him find a seat and then look back at the stop, at her, with the expression of a man who is calculating the load and knows he is already over the threshold and is not getting off the bus. She watched the bus pull away. She stood at the stop in the wet midnight air and thought about what he had said, everything under stress makes a sound before it breaks. She thought, I can hear myself. I've been able to hear myself since the convenience store. I just haven't wanted to stop. By the 3rd week they had stopped pretending the late-night convenience store trips were for the ramen. They had not said this out loud. They had simply, on a Tuesday, and then again on a Thursday, and then without organizing it by day at all, started arriving at approximately the same time, and the worker behind the counter, whose name they would eventually learn was June Gill and who had been working the midnight shift for 6 years and had seen several love stories begin at his counter, had started putting 2 cups of hot water out when he saw either of them walk in. They had not thanked him for this. They were both too invested in the fiction that nothing was happening. What was happening? She had started telling him things. Not the surface things, not the curated things she offered the world, the professional version, the competent version, the version that had its feelings organized. She told him about her mother, who had been cold in the specific way of Korean women who were taught that warmth was a vulnerability, and how she had spent 20 years trying to earn a tenderness that was not in her mother's vocabulary. He listened without trying to fix it. He said, did you ever stop trying? She said, I stopped when she did. She died when I was 26. He said, I'm sorry. She said, I'm not, I am, but I think I grieved something else. I grieved the possibility of it. That's a different kind of loss. He said, I know that one. He said it like someone touching a scar they thought had closed. He told her about his. The relationship that had lasted 4 years and had ended, not because of cruelty, not because of betrayal, but because he had loved her completely and she had not been able to stay inside that. She had said, at the end, you love too much. You make it too intense. I feel like I can't breathe. He had carried that sentence for 2 years. He had carried it like a diagnosis. He had carried it like a reason to keep the threshold. Seora heard this and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, she was wrong. She was afraid and she handed you her fear like it was a fact about you. He looked at her. She said, the intensity isn't the problem. The problem was that she couldn't hold it. Those are not the same thing. He had never heard anyone say this. In 2 years, no one had ever said it that way. He sat at the small plastic table and thought, this woman is dismantling 2 years of careful load calculations and she is doing it with one sentence, and I don't know if I'm grateful or terrified. He was both. 4 weeks in, she cancelled on him. Not dramatically, she sent a short message that said she was tired and would see him next week, the kind of message that means something else and is designed so the recipient can choose whether to understand that or pretend not to. He chose to understand it. He replied, okay. Take the time you need. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not push. He sat in his apartment and thought about the fact that she had been the one who always showed up first, who always had something ready to say, who managed the temperature of every interaction they had had with an invisible and expert hand, and that the message felt like the hand putting down the thermostat. She had cancelled because of a date. She had gone on a date with someone her friend had introduced her to, pleasant, employed, perfectly nice, the kind of man who represented her system in its ideal form, someone she could be with in a manageable way, someone who would not exceed the threshold. And she had sat across from this pleasant and perfectly nice man and thought, with the clarity of someone having an extremely inconvenient realization, that she did not want manageable. That she had been wanting manageable for 3 years because wanting anything larger was terrifying, and that the terror was still there, but sitting next to it now was something that refused to stay at a manageable size. She had gone home and sat in her clean apartment and felt her system doing what systems do when you've outgrown them, they don't break. They become cages. She called him. Not a message, a call, which was different, which cost more. He answered on the second ring. She said, I want to tell you something and I need you to not make it easy for me. He said, okay. She said, I went on a date tonight. He was quiet. She said, with someone perfectly appropriate who I felt nothing for, and the reason I felt nothing is sitting on my couch right now and it's me and it's you and I've been managing the distance between us for a month and I'm tired of it. A pause. He said, I've been waiting for you to stop managing it. She said, you could have said something. He said, it had to be you. You built the distance. You had to be the one to take it down. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I'm scared. He said, so am I. She said, you don't seem scared. He said, I'm terrified. I am genuinely, structurally terrified. She laughed, surprised, the real kind. He said, there you are. She said, what? He said, I've been looking for the laugh that isn't controlled. It's better than I thought. They had moved, by the 5th week, from the convenience store to her apartment on Sundays, not by announcement, but by the slow gravity of 2 people who had run out of excuses to keep meeting in a place with fluorescent lights and an audience. She cooked on the first Sunday, not to impress him, she was explicit about this, she cooked because she needed to do something with her hands during conversations that mattered, and this conversation mattered. She made doenjang jjigae and kept her back to him for portions of it, and he sat at her kitchen table and watched her and thought, she cooks like someone who is very comfortable alone. He thought, I want to be the thing that makes that comfort become a choice rather than a default. He told her about his father on the 5th Sunday. He had not told many people, not because he was ashamed but because the shape of it was hard to explain without it becoming the whole story, and he was not the whole story. His father had been a man who expressed love entirely through provision and entirely without presents, who had worked until there was nothing left of him to work, who had given his children everything material and almost nothing interior, who had died of a heart attack at 58 before Dowan had figured out how to say, I needed you to see me, not just support me. The grief of that, not just the death but the door that closed with it. The conversation they would never have now. She had set down her spoon and looked at him and said, you love completely. Your father didn't know how to receive it, and that became your belief that complete love is a problem rather than a capacity. He was quiet. She said, the woman who told you that you loved too much, she was the second person to teach you that lesson. He said, I know. She said, "It's not true." He said, "I'm starting to think you might be right." She said, "I know I'm right. I just don't know if knowing I'm right will make you believe it." He said, "Say it again." She said, "It is not too much. It has never been too much. It was given to people who were not large enough to hold it. Those are not the same thing." He looked at her across the kitchen table. He thought, I have been waiting for someone to say that for 10 years. 6 weeks in and she had a panic attack. Not her first, she had been having them since her mother's illness, infrequent but total, the kind that arrived without warning from the direction she was least watching. This one came at night in his apartment, the first night she had stayed past midnight, the first night she had let herself fall asleep on his couch and wake to find him still there, awake, working quietly at the other end of the room. She woke disoriented and the disorientation became the specific tunnel of a panic attack and she stood up too fast and her body went somewhere her mind could not follow. He was across the room before she could speak. He did not touch her, he understood, somehow, without being told, that touch during a panic attack was not always grounding, that it depended entirely on the person, and that the smart thing was to ask. He knelt down in front of her and said, very quietly, "Do you want me to touch your hands or do you want space?" She said hands. He took her hands in both of his and held them with the specific steady pressure of someone who builds structures for a living and understands that what is needed is not force but resistance. He said, "Breathe with me." He breathed slowly and audibly and she followed and after 4 minutes, she counted them, the tunnel opened. She came back into the room. He was still there. His hands were still around hers. She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Don't." She said, "I should have told you I get these." He said, "Yes. In the future, tell me things like that." She said, you're not scared of it." He said, "Of course not." She said, "The last person he stopped her. He said, "I'm not the last person. I'm not any of the people who made you expect that reaction." He said, "I build things that are meant to hold weight. I know the difference between a problem and a load. You are not a problem." She was very still. He was still holding her hands. She thought, this is what I've been protecting myself from. This. Not the pain of losing it, the unbearable lightness of having it. This is what scared me. Not the fall. The landing. The fight happened in the 3rd month and it happened because they were both people who had been hurt in the same way, who had both learned to protect themselves by becoming the first to withdraw, and they could not both withdraw at the same time without it becoming a wall. It started with a small thing, as the real fights always do. He had made a plan with her and then adjusted it without asking, and she had felt the adjustment as a signal, the specific signal she had been trained by damage to read as, "I am beginning to deprioritize you," and she had gone cold in the way she went cold, which was not dramatic but was total, the way a temperature drops in a room when a window has been left open somewhere. He noticed the cold immediately. He was constitutionally incapable of not noticing. This was one of the things about him, the structural attention, the awareness of when something under stress was making a sound. He said, "What happened?" She said, "Nothing." He said, "That's not true." She said, "I said it's fine." He said, "Sioria." The specific way he said her name, like a door he was refusing to close, broke something in her. She said, "You adjusted the plan without asking me and I know it's small and I know I'm reacting to something that happened before you, but that is exactly what he used to do." That is how it started with him. The small adjustments that meant I was beginning to matter less. He said, "I hear you." He said it and he meant it. He said, "And I need you to hear me too. I am not him. I will never be him. But I need you to tell me when something hits that place instead of going cold, because when you go cold I don't know what I'm working with and I will make it worse without meaning to." She was very still. She said, "I don't know how to do that yet." He said, "I know. We'll learn it." She said, "What if I can't stop going cold when I'm scared?" He said, "Then I'll sit with the cold until you come back. I won't chase you. I won't demand. I'll just Be here. Available. Until you're ready. She said, that's not a normal thing to offer someone. He said, you're not a normal situation. He meant it as the highest thing he knew how to say. This was the conversation that mattered more than any other they had had. Not because it resolved anything, it didn't, entirely. These patterns don't resolve over one kitchen table conversation, they take time and repetition and the slow re-education of a nervous system. But because they had it. Because neither of them left. Because two people who had both been trained to withdraw instead sat across from each other and described the wound and agreed, out loud, to try not to let it become the story. The months that followed were not a montage. They were not the version of a relationship that movies build, the seamless merging of two lives into one beautiful shared thing. They were difficult in the specific way that real things are difficult, inconsistently, unpredictably, with long stretches of extraordinary ease punctuated by the moments when one of them hit the edge of their old damage and the other one had to decide again, in real time, whether to stay or go. They always stayed. It was not always graceful. It was always intentional. She learned that he had a way of going silent when he was overwhelmed, not the performative silence of someone making a point, but the genuine retreat of a person who needed to process internally before he could speak. She learned not to fill the silence or interpret it or panic inside it. She learned to say, take the time you need, I'm here, and then to actually mean both parts of that. He learned that her coldness was never contempt, always fear, always the specific fear of someone who had been deprioritized slowly and had learned to read the early signs. He learned to name himself in those moments, I'm still here. You haven't lost anything. Watch what I do. They were not perfect. They did not become each other's cure. This is important because cure is not what broken people need from each other. What broken people need is a witness. Someone who sees the full shape of the damage and does not look away and does not try to fix it but simply, stays. Stays and stays and stays until staying becomes the evidence that rewrites the earlier story. That is not cure. That is something better than cure. That is the opposite of what caused the damage in the first place. She said it first. This surprised her. She had believed, given the architecture of her damage, that he would be the one to say it, that he loved with a completeness she was still learning to trust, and that this completeness would arrive at the word before she did. But it was her, on an ordinary Sunday, with the window open and the spring soul air coming through and him asleep on her sofa with one arm over his face the way he always slept when he had stayed late and the light had caught his hair and she had been standing in her kitchen with coffee thinking about absolutely nothing important. It was her. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him and thought it clearly, without alarm, without the system rising to challenge it, I love this man. I love him specifically. I love the way he listens like architecture, I love his hands, I love that he told me I was not too much, I love that he sat with me on the floor during the panic attack and held my hands with exactly the right pressure. I love him at his threshold and I love him over it. I love him. She set her coffee down. She went to the sofa. She sat on the edge of it. He felt her sit and took the arm from his face and looked at her with the unfocused eyes of someone not fully awake. She said, I love you. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, I know. She said, that's not what you're supposed to say. He said, I've known for a while. I was waiting for you to know it too. She said, that's insufferable. He said, yes. She said, I love you. He said, I love you. He said, I have loved you since the night at the bus stop when you stood in the rain and didn't move and I watched you from the window of the bus and thought that I would spend the rest of my life calculating what it was going to cost me and paying it anyway. She came back into his life in October. The woman who had told him he loved too much, her name was Yura and she had sent a message, careful and gentle, saying she had been thinking about what she said at the end and that she thought she had been wrong. She said, I was scared of how much you felt. I know now that it was my fear, not a fact about you. She said, I hope you're okay. She said, I'm sorry. He showed Siora the message that same evening. He did not hide it or deliberate about whether to share it. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and put his phone between them and said, I want you to read this. She read it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel?" He said, "Like someone confirmed a thing I had started to believe was true." She said, "That's good." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you going to reply to her?" He said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Take the time you need." He looked at her. He said, "You mean that?" She said, "Yes. I mean it because I'm not afraid of your history. Your history is the thing that made you into the person who held my hands through a panic attack and asked before he touched me and sat with my cold silences instead of leaving. I'm not afraid of what made you. I'm grateful for it." He looked at this woman across his kitchen table and thought about the systems they had both built. The precision of their respective protections. The specific damage that had produced both of them and had somehow, against the calculations, produced this. He thought about the rainy Tuesday and the ramen cups and the bus stop and the convenience store worker who had put out 2 cups of hot water without being asked. He thought about the panic attack floor and the fight that they had stayed in and the Sunday she had said "I love you" before she'd planned to. He thought, we were both under stress for years. We were both making sounds before we broke. And we found each other right at the edge of the threshold, right at the moment when the structure either fails or holds. He reached across the table and took her hand. He thought, this is holding. A year from the rainy Tuesday. Her apartment had his jacket on the chair and his engineering books on the lower shelf she had cleared without telling him she was clearing it. His apartment had her design work on the spare desk and the specific coffee she liked and the small graphic she had made him, a structural diagram of a bridge, but annotated in her font opinion handwriting with notes like, "This is where it wants to fail," and "This is where it decides not to." He had put it in a frame. It was on the wall above his desk. She pretended this did not destroy her every time she saw it. It destroyed her every time she saw it. The system was gone. Not dismantled, transformed. She still had her organized apartment and her full schedule and her need for solitude on certain evenings, and he still had his threshold awareness and his processing silences and the way he calculated the load before he said the thing. These were not problems now. They were the texture of 2 specific people who had taken their damage seriously and built something out of the other side of it. The system had become something else. Something that did not need to protect her from him because he was not something to protect herself from. She had learned the difference. She had learned it slowly and at some cost, and it was the most valuable thing she had ever learned. On a Tuesday, always Tuesdays, they had started to notice. They passed the convenience store where June Gill was working his midnight shift and he saw them through the glass and gave the specific nod of a man who has witnessed the beginning of something and is pleased it did not end. Dowen raised a hand. Ciora laughed. They did not go in. They had somewhere to be, his apartment, a meal she was making, nothing that would be remembered as significant in 50 years. Just a Tuesday. Just the life they were building from what they had almost been too careful to let happen. He designed something for her. Not a building, something smaller. A renovation plan for the community design studio she had been trying to fund for 2 years, a space where young designers in the neighborhood could work, the dream she had mentioned once in passing at the convenience store table and then not again because she was in the habit of carrying her large hopes quietly so that disappointment, when it came, would only fall on her. He had remembered. He had drawn plans on spare evenings for 3 months. He presented them to her on a Sunday morning with the same directness he brought to everything. Here is the structural plan, here is what it can hold, here is what I thought about when I drew it. She looked at the plans for a long time. They were good, they were better than good, they were the plans of a person who had listened to everything she had said about the space and what she wanted it to do for people and had translated it into something that could actually stand. There were annotations in his handwriting, natural light priority here, flexible wall for reconfiguration, this corner is for the person who needs to work alone. She had told him about that corner, about needing, as a young designer, a corner that felt like hers. He had remembered that too. She pressed her hands flat on the plans and kept them there and thought, he was listening every time. Every time I talked about the things I carried quietly, he was listening. He built a room for the person I described and it is the right room. It is the exact right room. She said, you did this. He said, you described it. I drew what you described. She said, Dao Na. He waited. She said, you are the first person who has ever made me feel like the things I carry quietly are worth listening to. He said, they're worth more than listening to. They're worth building. She thought about that for the rest of the day. She thought about it for the rest of the year. She thought about it on the evenings she was designing other people's spaces and needed to remember why she had started. They talked about fear, one evening in the second year, with the directness that had become the dialect between them, the language of two people who had learned that naming things was less dangerous than leaving them unnamed. She said, I'm still afraid sometimes. Not of you. Of this, of how much I have to lose now. He said, me too. She said, does it get easier? He said, I think it changes. I think the fear changes from the fear of investing in something that might fail to the fear of not having invested fully in something real. She said, that's not easier. He said, no. It's better. Those are different. She said, if something happened and this ended. He stopped her gently. He said, I'm not going anywhere. She said, you don't know that. He said, you're right, I don't. No one does. But here is what I know, I am choosing you today. And tomorrow I will choose you again. And that is not a guarantee, but it is a practice, and I think a practice held over enough days becomes the closest thing to certainty that two people who are paying attention can build. She was quiet for a moment. She said, you sound like a structural engineer. He said, I'm aware. She said, it's one of your best qualities. He said, my font opinions are also very good. She looked at him. She said, you don't have any font opinions. He said, I have opinions about your opinions about fonts. That's adjacent. She laughed. He thought, there it is. A year and a half and still the laugh is the best thing in the room. It rained on the Tuesday that was exactly 1 year from the Tuesday where it started, and she noticed this, and she told him, and he said, of course it did. They were in his kitchen. She was making the coffee. He was at the table with his notebook. He still kept the notebooks, still wrote before he slept, and she looked at him in the kitchen and thought about the convenience store and the bus stop and the panic attack floor and the kitchen table fights and the Sunday mornings and the plans rolled out with annotations in his handwriting, and she thought, I had a system. I built it carefully. I maintained it for 3 years and it protected me from everything except him. And I am so grateful that it failed. He looked up from his notebook. He said, what are you thinking about? She said, the system. He said, the one from before. She said, yes. He said, and? She said, and I think I owe it a kind of gratitude. It kept me intact long enough to get here. He said, and here is, she said, here is where I want to be. Without the system. Without the management. Just, here. With the coffee I'm making in your kitchen on a rainy Tuesday with everything I was afraid of having to lose. He put down the notebook. He stood up. He came to the kitchen and stood behind her and put his arms around her from behind and she leaned back into him and they stood like that in his kitchen while the rain came down outside and Seoul went on being enormous and indifferent and full of people at their various thresholds, deciding or not deciding, staying or not staying, building or not building. 2 of those people were in a kitchen. Holding on. Choosing each other as a practice that had, over enough days, become the closest thing to certainty they knew how to build. That was everything. That was the whole thing. That was enough.